Welcome to No Signal Horror. Here, the dark stories begin. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and get ready for a different experience. If you want the horror to reach you first, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and become one of the darkness lovers. They say she's just a story, a whisper in the dark. But what if the shadows aren't just shadows? What if the screams you hear aren't the wind? What if the village witch has finally decided to return, not in myth, but in flesh and fear, to claim what was always hers? The village of Oakhaven clung to the side of a forgotten valley like a stubborn moss, perpetually shrouded in the scent of damp earth and pine. Generations had lived and died within its weathered stone walls, each passing down not just the land, but the hushed tales that shaped its very soul. And of all the tales, the most enduring, the most deeply etched into the collective memory, was that of Elara, the village witch. Her name, even now, carried a faint, bitter tang on the tongue, a residue of ancient fear and condemnation. For decades, her house had stood as a gaunt sentinel on the northern edge of Oakhaven, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It was a place where shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally, where the air was always colder, thinner. Its windows, like vacant, sightless eyes, stared out over the village, reflecting nothing but the slow, inevitable decay of time. Children dared to approach its crumbling threshold, would inevitably return pale and breathless, swearing they'd heard whispers or felt an unseen hand brush their hair. But these were just stories, the elders would patiently explain, the fanciful imaginings of youth amplified by the wind whistling through broken panes. Elara, the witch, was dead. Her reign of fear, if it had ever truly existed beyond the bounds of terrified rumor, was long over. Elias Thorne, a man whose hands bore the calluses of a city architect rather than a farmer, had returned to Oakhaven not out of nostalgia, but necessity. His mother, Agnes, had fallen ill, and with his father long gone, the duty of care fell squarely upon him. He had left Oakhaven 15 years ago, a boy eager to shed the suffocating weight of its traditions and superstitions. He remembered the stories, of course. Elara, the mysterious woman who lived alone, whose knowledge of herbs and healing was viewed with suspicion rather than gratitude, whose independence was perceived as defiance. The whispers of curses, of crops blighting, of unexplained illnesses, all conveniently laid at her door. He remembered the fire, too, a sudden, furious conflagration that had consumed her home and, presumably, her, leaving behind only the charred husk that now stood. The official verdict was accidental, a spark from the hearth. But the unofficial verdict, the one whispered behind cupped hands, was different. He dismissed it all as the irrational fears of an isolated community. Now, back in the quiet, stifling embrace of the valley, he found himself recalling those forgotten fragments of lore with an unsettling clarity. The first whispers of her return began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the first rustle of leaves before a storm. It started with the older women, those whose lives had been lived entirely within the village bounds, their minds still fertile ground for ancient fears. Marta, the baker's wife, a woman whose eyes always seemed to hold a flicker of perpetual anxiety, swore she saw a shadow dart across her kitchen window one moonless night. Not a human shadow, she insisted, but something elongated, distorted, moving with an unnatural fluidity. Like a serpent, she'd rasped, her voice dry as autumn leaves. But tall, impossibly tall. Then came the sounds. Initially, they were dismissed. The wind, tearing through the valley, the cry of a fox, the distant baying of old man Hemlock's hound. But as the weeks bled into one another, the sounds grew more distinct, more frequent, more terrifyingly human. A wail, thin and high-pitched, like a child lost in the woods, echoing from the direction of Elara's ruined house. Then deeper, a guttural shriek that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night itself. Elias, pragmatic and a man of science, initially scoffed. "It's the wind, Marta, playing tricks on old wood. Or maybe a badger." He tried to ground the village in logic, to pull them back from the precipice of their ancestral fears. But even he, after several nights of restless sleep, found himself straining to discern shapes in the gloom beyond his window, his heart thrumming with a rhythm he couldn't to quite a tribute to the chill of the night air. The transformation of Oakhaven was gradual but profound. The jovial clatter of evening conversations in the village square grew quieter, replaced by hushed whispers. Doors, once left ajar on warm summer evenings, were now bolted shut before dusk, their heavy locks echoing a collective fear. Children, once allowed to play freely until the stars appeared, were now called inside before the sun even dipped below the hills, their parents' faces etched with a new, unspoken anxiety. Agnes, Elias's mother, seemed to be particularly susceptible. Her illness had weakened her body, but her mind, always steeped in the village's oral history, was a canvas for dread. "She's back, Elias," she'd murmur from her bed, her voice thin as a spider's silk. "Elara, I hear her. She calls to me." "It's the fever, Mother," Elias would gently insist, stroking her damp forehead. "Just bad dreams." But even as he spoke the words, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. His mother's eyes, usually clouded by illness, held a piercing clarity when she spoke of Elara, a terror that felt too real to be mere delirium. One crisp autumn evening, a week after Elias's return, the unsettling phenomena escalated. Young Thomas, the son of the village cooper, was found huddled in the woods at dawn, incoherent with terror. He had gone out to retrieve a stray lamb that had wandered from the fold. His parents found him hours later, curled into a fetal position beneath an ancient oak, his eyes wide and vacant. He couldn't speak, could only point a trembling finger towards the dense, shadowed thicket, whispering a single word: shadow. Long. No face. The village doctor, a gruff man named Dr. Finch, who had inherited his practice and his skepticism from his father, declared it a severe case of shock, likely induced by a wild animal. But the cooper, a man of few words and sturdy common sense, had seen the look in his son's eyes. He knew it wasn't a wolf. The following night, the screams were undeniable. They began just after midnight, a sound that ripped through the valley, not like a human voice, but like a raw, ancient agony full of despair and fury. It wasn't one scream, but a chorus, waxing and waning, seeming to emanate from multiple points around the desolate witch's house. Elias, jolted awake, sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound was too visceral, too present to be dismissed as mere wind. He crept to his window, peering out into the moonless night. The village below was a tapestry of deeper shadows, but from the direction of the old house, he could almost sense the vibrations of the sound, a tangible wave of terror washing over the valley. He wasn't alone. Lights flickered on in other houses, brave men and women creeping to their windows, their faces pale as they listened to the symphony of terror. He saw his neighbor, old Mr. Caldwell, a man who had faced down rabid wolves and winter blizzards without a flicker of fear, standing by his window, his hands pressed against the glass as if to ward off an unseen entity. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. The screaming subsided as suddenly as it began, leaving behind an oppressive, echoing silence. The only sound was the frantic barking of dogs, their fear palpable in the crisp night air. Elias pulled away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a story anymore. This was happening. The next morning, the village was a changed place. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Farmers delayed going to their fields. The market square, usually bustling with early morning trade, was unnaturally quiet. No one spoke of the previous night directly, but every averted gaze, every nervous glance towards the northern hills, every hushed conversation confirmed that the terror had solidified. Elias, attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy, walked to the local tavern, the Oakhaven Mug, for a morning coffee. It was usually a lively hub of gossip and debate. Today, however, only a handful of men sat hunched over their drinks, their faces grim. Old Barnaby, the tavern keeper, a man whose stories were as potent as his ale, polished a mug with uncharacteristic vigor, his eyes darting towards the door every few seconds. "Morning, Barnaby," Elias offered, trying to keep his voice steady. Barnaby merely grunted, pushing a steaming mug of coffee towards him. "Sleep well, Elias?" The question was laced with sarcasm, a common Oakhaven trait. As well as anyone could, I suppose, Elias replied, taking a sip. The coffee was strong, bitter. What do you make of it all? Barnaby leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's her, lad, Elara. Back from the grave. I knew it. Always knew she wouldn't stay buried. Barnaby, come on. Elias sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It's irrational. There must be a logical explanation. Some animal, a prank, who knows? Barnaby snorted, a deep rumbling sound from his chest. Logical explanation? You city folk and your logic. There's things in this world, Elias, that logic can't touch. Things that live in the shadows, fueled by old grudges. You weren't here when she walked among us, son. You didn't see the fear in people's eyes. You didn't hear the stories of what she could do. And what could she do, Barnaby? Elias pressed, a strange mix of curiosity and dread stirring within him. He wanted to understand the roots of this fear, to find a rational explanation for the collective hysteria. Barnaby's eyes, usually twinkling with mischief, were now flat and serious. She could see things, know things. She'd tell folk their darkest secrets without them ever speaking a word. She'd heal some, curse others. Crops withered on the vine after she walked past a field. Children fell ill after she cast her gaze upon them. And her eyes, Elias, they were like chips of ice, cold, knowing. He shivered despite the warmth of the tavern. And then, the fire. They say she started it herself, a final act of defiance. Or perhaps it was started for her. His gaze shifted away, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Elias noticed the subtle hesitation, the unspoken implication. The village had always been quick to condemn Elara, but the way Barnaby spoke, it hinted at a deeper, darker history. What do you mean, started for her? Barnaby shook his head, retreating behind his usual gruff demeanor. Old tales, lad. Doesn't matter now. What matters is she's back, and she's not happy. He gestured vaguely towards the window, towards the direction of the old house. The fear, once a distant echo of children's stories, had now seeped into the very fabric of Oakhaven. It manifested in strange ways. The village dogs, usually loyal companions, grew skittish, barking at nothing, their hackles raised. Livestock, particularly the sheep and goats, were found huddled together in their pens, trembling, their eyes wide with fear. A pervasive chill seemed to settle over the village, even on unseasonably warm days, raising goosebumps on skin. Elias began to experience the unsettling phenomena himself. He would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, a fleeting shadow at the edge of his perception, only for it to vanish when he turned his head directly. He'd dismiss it as fatigue, as tricks of the light, but the regularity of it, the distinct feeling of being watched, began to erode his composure. One afternoon, while tending to his mother, he heard a sound from the floor below, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching, like nails on wood. He paused, listening intently. It stopped. He attributed it to the old house settling, or a mouse. But then it resumed, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't an animal. It sounded primal, ancient, filled with a malevolent intent. He crept downstairs, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. The scratching and growling stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. He searched the ground floor, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing. The doors were locked, the windows secured. He felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, a cold dread that logic couldn't dispel. He was alone in the house, yet he felt an undeniable presence. The climax of the village's collective dread arrived a week later. It was a market day, and despite the underlying tension, a few more villagers than usual had ventured out. Elias was at the butcher's stall, discussing a cut of meat, when a sudden collective gasp rippled through the square. All heads turned towards the northern road, the path that led past Elara's house. Standing there, impossibly tall and gaunt against the midday sun, was a figure. It was indistinct, shimmering as if viewed through heat haze, Yet its form was undeniably human, or a grotesque caricature of one. Long skeletal arms seemed to reach out, almost touching the ground. Its head was bowed, or perhaps it had no discernible features, merely a void. The market square fell silent, a breathless, terrified hush. Then, a woman shrieked, a piercing primal sound that broke the spell of frozen horror. The figure, or shadow, or whatever it was, began to move. Not walking, but gliding, a seamless, unnerving motion towards the village. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, like smoke given malicious sentience. Panic erupted. Stalls were overturned, goods scattered. People screamed, pushing and shoving, desperate to get indoors, to find safety behind locked doors. Children cried, clinging to their parents' legs. Elias, caught in the surge of bodies, felt a cold, inexplicable terror grip him. He stared at the approaching figure, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he believed. It was impossible. It had to be a trick of light, a mass hallucination, but the shared terror, the genuine visceral fear radiating from every person around him, made it horrifyingly real. The figure continued its slow, deliberate glide. It seemed to grow larger with every passing second, its form becoming more defined, more menacing. He could almost discern the tattered remnants of clothing, a dark, flowing fabric that seemed to absorb the light. Then he heard it. A faint, dry cackle, like rustling leaves, carried on the wind, followed by a low, guttural chant, a string of ancient, indecipherable words that seemed to twist the very air around them. The sound was not loud, but it resonated deep within his bones, a vibration of malevolence. The figure paused just at the edge of the market square, its form solidifying for a terrifying moment. Elias could feel its gaze upon him, a cold, predatory weight that squeezed the breath from his lungs. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, to hide, to simply cease to exist. But he was frozen, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of its return. The villagers had mostly fled, leaving Elias and a few others caught in the open, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised one long, skeletal arm, its hand gnarled and claw-like, pointing directly at the center of the village, and as it pointed, a wave of profound cold washed over Elias, making his teeth chatter, a cold that felt not of the weather, but of pure, ancient malice. The sound of the rustling cackle grew louder, closer, and the whispered chant solidified into something Elias could almost understand, a language of suffering and retribution. He felt his sanity fraying at the edges, the concrete world around him dissolving into a nightmare. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to shimmer and dissipate, its form blurring, stretching until it dissolved entirely into the sunlight, leaving behind only the profound silence of a terrified village and a chill that lingered in the very marrow of Elias' bones. The aftermath was a desperate attempt to regain control. Dr. Finch, now pale and shaken, tried to assure everyone it was a shared delusion, a byproduct of the recent stresses. The local priest, Father Michael, led prayers and urged faith. But the villagers knew. The fear was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. For Elias, the experience had shattered his skepticism. He had seen it. He had felt it. The witch was back, and she was not content with mere shadows and screams. Her presence was now a tangible threat, a malevolent force unleashed upon Oakhaven. That night, alone in his mother's darkened house, Elias couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of the wind outside, sent his heart racing. He sat by the window, peering out into the oppressive darkness, a heavy shotgun cradled in his lap, its cold metal a small comfort against the encroaching terror. He told himself it was for protection, for his mother, for the village. But deep down, he knew the futility of it. How do you fight a shadow that can solidify? A scream that rips through your soul, a presence that defies all logic and reason. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound began, not from within his house, but from outside his window, directly on the glass. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was the same sound he had heard downstairs, but now it was intimate, immediate. He slowly, painstakingly, lifted his head, his eyes fixed on the dark pane. Then a faint outline began to form on the glass. Not a reflection, but an imprint, as if something incredibly cold and sharp were tracing lines on the outside. It was the shape of a gnarled, claw-like hand, long fingers tapering to points, slowly, deliberately, leaving a frosty, ephemeral mark on the window. And as the last finger etched itself into being, a whisper, dry and ancient, seemed to resonate directly inside his mind, chilling him to his very core. "You've been watching, haven't you, little Elias? Now it's my turn to watch you." The voice was not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones, a cold tremor that vibrated through his skull. The frosty hand on the glass pulsed, glowing with an inner spectral light, and then, slowly, impossibly, it began to push inwards. The old window pane, thick and sturdy, groaned under an unseen pressure, a spiderweb of cracks blooming outwards from the tips of the icy fingers. Elias stumbled back, the shotgun clattering against the floorboards as he stared, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. This wasn't a shadow or a whisper anymore. It was physical, destructive. The glass splintered, not with a crash, but with a high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. Shards, gleaming with the same spectral frost, flew inwards, embedding themselves in the curtains, the wallpaper, even his skin. A gust of impossibly cold air blasted into the room, carrying with it the stench of wet earth, decay, and something else, something ancient and hungry. Through the gaping hole where the window had been, a form began to coalesce, a shadow deepening into a monstrous silhouette against the moonless sky. It was too tall, too gaunt, with limbs that seemed to stretch and contort beyond human comprehension. Its head, if it had one, was lost in the inky blackness, but two pinpricks of malevolent light, like dying embers, appeared somewhere in its upper reaches, fixing themselves on Elias. He fumbled for the shotgun, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it again. This was it. The thing from the woods, the source of Oakhaven's torment, was here, in his mother's house, for him. With a guttural cry ripped from the deepest part of his fear, he raised the weapon, pointing it blindly at the encroaching darkness. He pulled the trigger. The roar of the blast was deafening in the confined space, the flash momentarily blinding. He felt the kickback, saw the pattern of buckshot pepper the shadowy form. But there was no scream, no sound of pain, only a ripple in the darkness, a momentary distortion like firing into smoke. The two pinpricks of light merely intensified, burning with cold amusement. Then, a long skeletal arm, impossibly thin and ending in the same claw-like hand, snaked into the room, moving with terrifying speed. It didn't grab him, didn't strike. Instead, it reached past him, towards the wall, towards a framed photograph of his mother from years ago, smiling, vibrant. With a deliberate, horrifying slowness, the claw traced her face in the glass, leaving the same frosty imprint, before shattering it into 1,000 pieces. "Your mother, she won't be watching anymore." The dry whisper echoed again, this time far closer, resonating from within the shadow itself. "But you, little Elias, you will. You will see everything. You will feel everything. And you will never look away." The darkness surged forward, not as a physical attack, but as an engulfing presence. It was a cold that burned, a pressure that crushed, a silence that screamed. Elias felt his mind unraveling, his consciousness dissolving into the vast, ancient malevolence. He tried to fight, to scream, to raise the shotgun again, but his limbs were numb, his voice lost. He felt himself being lifted, not by hands, but by an unseen current, drawn towards the gaping maw of the broken window, towards the impossibly vast and hungry form that waited beyond. The last thing he saw before the world was consumed by an all-encompassing freezing blackness was the faint eerie glow of the moonlight illuminating the skeletal branches of the ancient trees in the woods, now appearing like grasping fingers reaching towards Oakhaven. And from somewhere deep within the merging void, he understood. He wasn't being killed, he was being integrated. He was becoming a part of the watching, a new pair of eyes for the entity, bound to witness Oakhaven's slow, agonizing decay, trapped in a silent, eternal scream. The village, once vibrant, was now just a larder for an ancient hunger, and he, Elias, was merely one more ingredient, a silent sentinel to its ultimate consumption. The darkness flowed into the house, into the village, into every crack and crevice, silencing the wind, stilling the night, leaving behind only the profound, suffocating emptiness of its final victory.